Hello everyone, I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Get comfortable and relax. Story 1. The Mickey Mouse Suit. It was supposed to be the perfect vacation, a full week of sun, snacks and smiling children, all under the shimmering skies of Florida. My wife and I had planned the trip months in advance. For the kids, it was all about Disney World. For us grown-ups, it was more about escaping the dreary grip of Maine's moody weather. We needed warmth, something to melt away the endless grey that clung to New England like a wet coat. The plan was simple. Spend 3 days doing the whole Disney thing with the kids and fill the rest of the week with more adult-oriented sightseeing, food hunts and general laziness. The day started bright and the kids were practically levitating from excitement. We had ventured into downtown Orlando for a more relaxed day. No rides, no lines, no sticky theme park food, just wandering around, soaking up the sun. I had only one mission that morning: hunt down and devour an authentic Cuban sandwich. And I found it. A beast of a thing. Crispy bread, stacked pork, pickles, mustard, melted cheese. Heaven in handheld form. As I waddled behind my wife and the kids, struggling under the weight of the sandwich in my belly, she excused herself to find a restroom, leaving me in charge of wrangling the little ones. Now this is where I'll admit, I didn't exactly step into my full dad mode. I found a bench close by, dropped into it with a dramatic exhale and told the kids to stay where I could see them. Then, of course, I did the unthinkable. I shut my eyes. Just for a second, I told myself. A few moments of lizard-like sunbathing. But in those fleeting minutes of semi-consciousness, the world around me continued to move. When I blinked back to life, my heart hit my ribs. The kids, where were they? I shot up, head swiveling, searching, and then I saw them. My son, standing just a ways down the sidewalk, talking to someone dressed like Mickey Mouse. Now, I'd heard that sometimes people in Disney character suits wandered downtown to entertain tourists, but this... something felt off. The suit was wrong, not just in design. It wasn't quite right in proportions or colouring, but also in condition. It was filthy, grimy patches of who knew what smeared the fabric. The head of the costume was stained. The whites of the eyes weren't even white anymore, and he just stood there, still. Silent. I called to the kids, but they were too excited. "Dad! Mickey!" they shouted with glee, dancing around the character as if they had just won the lottery. As I got closer, I noticed something that made the hairs on my arm stand straight up. He wasn't engaging with them. No high fives, no waves, just standing there, eyes fixed on my children in a way that made my stomach tighten. Trying to stay calm, I pulled out a $20 bill from my wallet and extended it toward him. "Hey, thanks for entertaining the kids. Here, grab yourself a drink or something." But he didn't respond. The head of the costume slowly tilted toward me, not naturally, but with a sharp, deliberate movement, the kind you see in horror movies. Big, lifeless eyes locking onto mine. Not a word, not a nod, just that tilt. I instinctively pulled the money back, unsure of what I was even dealing with. "All right, kids, time to go," I said with an edge of steel in my voice, but they protested, bouncing around the silent Mickey. That's when he moved, reached out, his hands slowly extending toward my son, not in a playful way, not with a cartoonish gesture, but like someone trying to grab something fragile. I stepped between them. "Do not touch my kids," I said firmly. He didn't respond, didn't move, just stared. With my heart hammering, I scooped up both of my kids and led them back toward where my wife would soon be returning. As I walked away, I turned my head to glance back. Mickey was still watching us, his head tilted even further, motionless. That night, the air conditioning in our motel room chose to die. The kids' room next door still had cold air, thank goodness, so my wife and I agreed to let them sleep there while we sweated through the night. I tossed and turned for hours, haunted not by dreams, but by the image of that grimy Mickey mask and the dead stare that had followed me down the street. At some point, I gave up trying to sleep. I sat in the little kitchenette, sipping ice water and hoping the Florida heat would give me a break. The motel was built in a horseshoe layout, single-story bungalows arranged around a parking lot, with the front windows facing the road. I wandered over to the window, peeked through the blinds, and froze. There he was, Mickey, silhouetted by a street lamp, standing completely still near the edge of the highway. I blinked hard, telling myself it was just someone else, a coincidence. But that silhouette was unmistakable. The oversized ears, the massive gloves, the posture. I ducked away from the window, heart racing. No, I whispered to myself, no way. He couldn't have followed us. There was no way he could have known where we were staying. Unless he had been watching us. Without the suit, he would look like anyone else. Could have been tailing us all day. That thought pulled something primal out of me. I rushed to the kitchenette drawer, grabbed the biggest knife I could find, and returned to the window. When I looked again, he was gone. But not gone, something had changed. Lying in the parking lot, closer to the motel, maybe 100 feet away, was the Mickey costume. Empty, crumpled, just there. My breath caught in my throat. What the hell was I looking at? Then, with a jolt of horror, something slammed against the window. A face. His real face. Pressed right against the glass. Bare, sweaty, wild-eyed, completely naked. His eyes were wide, mouth open, fogging the glass as he pounded his head against it. I screamed. A real scream, raw and high and loud. It woke up my wife, who came running. I ordered her to lock herself and the kids in the other room and call the police. The man at the window didn't try to speak, just kept pounding. His forehead, his fists. I shouted that the police were coming and waved the knife like a madman. That got a reaction. He turned and ran, right toward our door. I braced myself, standing between the door and my family, adrenaline crashing through my body. He slammed against it, over and over, but thank God, it held. Minutes passed like hours, then silence. I peeked through the blinds again. Gone, and the costume? Gone too. When the police arrived, I could finally breathe again. I gave them everything. Description, timeline, what had happened earlier in the day. They searched the area, but they didn't find him. They never found him. We flew home the next day. I called the Orlando police weeks later to check for updates. Nothing. No arrests. I don't know what he wanted. I don't know who he was. But I know this, he found us once. And it's that knowledge that he could do it again that still keeps me up some nights. Story 2, Celebration. There is a town in central Florida that on the surface looks like something straight out of a fairy tale. Its name is Celebration. Built with manicured streets, pastel-colored homes, white picket fences, and carefully curated holiday decor, it was designed to be the embodiment of the American dream, a place where the mundane pressures of everyday life would dissolve into a constant atmosphere of sunshine, smiles, and serenity. And not by accident, this community was conceived, constructed, and marketed by none other than the Walt Disney Company. It was, quite literally, meant to be the happiest town on earth. But underneath its charming facade, a different story began to fester. A story not about fantasy, but fear. Not about dreams, but about deception. It all began in the 1990s, when Disney had the ambitious vision to not just entertain families, but to house them. The idea was to build a residential community that mirrored the ideals often portrayed in its movies, a kind of real-life Main Street USA. With a nearly $5 billion investment, the company constructed Celebration on the outskirts of Disney World in Orlando. What emerged was a town unlike any other. Residents were selected through a lottery, and people from around the country, especially Disney enthusiasts, clamored for the chance to be part of this model society. When homes first went on sale, more than 10,000 applications were received for just 500 houses. On paper, the town was a utopia. Streets lined with flowering trees, seasonal changes carefully curated, literal fall leaves shipped in from northern states during autumn, and fake snow sprinkled over rooftops during Florida's warmer Christmas months. The air at times was even filled with ambient music or recorded birdsong playing from nearly invisible speakers perched high in the trees. Every detail had been planned with immersive perfection in mind. Celebration, they said, wasn't just a town, it was a dream. But very quickly that dream began to show cracks. The rules in Celebration were exhaustive. A 160-page handbook governed every inch of the town's lifestyle. Homeowners weren't allowed to plant certain types of flowers. They weren't allowed to choose just any window covering. Curtains had to be white on the exterior side for visual uniformity. Garbage cans were to be stored behind the house, completely out of sight. Every home was required to display a Mickey Mouse figure somewhere, whether inside or outside. Even the lawns had to be trimmed to a precise length. On the surface, it was about maintaining aesthetics, but for many, it began to feel like something more insidious, a kind of enforced happiness, where deviation from the ideal was not just frowned upon, but punished. Residents described receiving strongly worded letters for even the smallest violations, faded paint, uneven ground cover, or plant choices that didn't align with Disney's ideal. One long-time couple, Jan and Ori Scheisel, retired from Michigan and early residents of the town, were quoted saying, "If you're not one for rules and regulations, you really don't want to live here." They explained how no two adjacent homes were allowed to look alike, how residents were limited to 2 visible cars per household, and how every exterior had to conform to visual standards that began to feel more like constraints than community pride. But even all of that might have been tolerable if it weren't for what started to happen next. It began with whispered rumors and isolated incidents. Then the whispers grew louder. In 1998, a terrifying armed home invasion rocked Celebration. A local couple were brutally beaten, tied up and robbed inside their own house by masked attackers. The shock rippled through the tight-knit community. This wasn't supposed to happen in Celebration. But the violence was only the beginning. Years later, in November of 2010, a teacher named Matteo Giovandito, known by his neighbors for being quiet and kind, failed to show up for work. When police arrived at his home to conduct a welfare check, they were overwhelmed by the stench of death. What they discovered inside was something no one in a supposedly perfect town should ever see. Matteo had been strangled, his body dismembered with an axe and left in grotesque condition. He lived alone, save for his pet chihuahua. The killer, David Israel Murillo, was a homeless drifter who later claimed Matteo had tried to assault him, sparking a violent reaction. Murillo was arrested and sentenced to life in prison. But the story didn't end there. After news of the murder broke, former students of Matteo came forward with disturbing revelations. Several boys, some as young as 10 at the time, described how Matteo had groomed and abused them during school trips abroad. Mexico, China, Japan. One mother said Matteo was a cunning predator who had preyed on her son for years before being abruptly cut off. The community, once reeling from the brutality of his death, now struggled with the horror of what may have led to it. Only days after Matteo's gruesome murder, another resident, Craig Fushi, his neighbor, barricaded himself inside his own house and opened fire on police officers who had arrived to question him. The siege lasted 12 hours before Craig turned the gun on himself, ending his life. Authorities speculated his involvement in a wider circle of abuse within Celebration's community. The paradise was starting to look like a powder keg. Even the town's geography held secrets. On the outskirts of Celebration sits a body of water locals began to call the Death Pond. Originally unmarked and surrounded by little more than trees, the pond became infamous after a series of tragedies occurred near its banks. Cars slid off the road into its dark waters. A 2-year-old boy was reportedly snatched by an alligator while playing at the water's edge. The most disturbing case involved 3 young men who disappeared while vacationing in Florida. 9 months later, their bodies were found submerged inside a car at the bottom of the pond. Their deaths only added to the town's unsettling aura. And then there were the other kinds of rumors. Whispers of affairs and infidelity began to spread, some residents referring to the town's rampant separations. A British property investor who had moved to the area described the place as incestuous. According to him, couples arrived happily married and often ended up divorced within months. He claimed wife swapping was common and that many came to Celebration to escape their pasts and reinvent themselves, only to find the same loneliness and confusion waiting behind the pastel walls and manicured lawns. Eventually, Disney washed its hands of the whole town. In 2004, the company sold Celebration to a property investment firm based in New York. The move was quiet, understated, but for those who had watched the town slowly unravel, it felt like a betrayal. The dream, it seemed, had become too costly to maintain. Still, some residents insist that Celebration is misunderstood. On the town's website, the official narrative is pristine. Celebration was founded, it says, with the idea of creating a better place and a better way to live. They frame it as a community, not a town, a collection of caring neighbors, not suspicious strangers. Many of the online reviews posted in defense of Celebration sound eerily similar. Some believe they were written by marketers or public relations teams trying to salvage the town's reputation. One woman wrote, "I've lived in Celebration for almost a decade and wouldn't live anywhere else. It's a beautiful place with beautiful people." Another commented on the year-round fireworks, the safe walking trails, the sense of pride in every home. They described their lives as joyful, peaceful, nearly perfect. But then again, perhaps that's just another layer of the illusion, because under the crisp lawns and spotless sidewalks, under the smiling greetings and regulated curtain colors, Celebration seems to hide a different story. A story where smiles are masks, rules are chains, and something sinister lingers just out of sight. For every postcard image of a laughing child playing on a white picket lawn, there is a hidden headline about abuse, about blood in the water, about darkness behind the blinds. And while Celebration might still look like the happiest place on earth from the outside, those who've lived there, who've looked just a little too closely, know better. They've seen what lurks behind the perfection, and they know that even in paradise, monsters sometimes move in. Story 3. The Man Who Wasn't Her Father. Every child dreams of going to Disney World. For most, it's the pinnacle of childhood fantasy, a world of magic, adventure, and the sense that all things are good and safe. For me and my younger sister, that dream became real in the summer of 1998, a year so far behind me now, yet so vivid in fragments that it could have been yesterday. Our parents had saved and planned, carefully setting aside enough money, time and energy to take us across the Atlantic from the UK to the sun-drenched chaos of Florida. Back then, I had little concept of just how exhausting a vacation like that might be for two parents in their 30s. In hindsight, I imagine they were less thrilled about the prospect of long lines and overpriced food than we were, but for my sister and me it was nothing short of a miracle. Florida was everything I imagined. Strange trees with impossibly broad leaves, food portions the size of small buildings, and sunlight so aggressive it felt like it could peel your skin if you weren't careful. I remember being captivated by the idea of gator farms, living dinosaurs you could feed raw meat to, and being too afraid to do it myself. I remember the thrill of holding a box of StarCraft in my hands before it was even available back home. And I remember more than anything else the anticipation of Animal Kingdom. It was our third day at Disney World, and Animal Kingdom was the crown jewel. I was obsessed with natural history, had watched The Lion King until the VHS tape practically wore out, and couldn't wait to see the safari tour, the exotic animals, the wild trees that seemed to spring straight from African plains into the center of Florida. That morning, the air buzzed with heat and anticipation. Every kid we saw had the same expression of wonder carved onto their faces, except one. I first noticed her on the shuttle bus, a girl, maybe 6 or 7, sitting next to a man I assumed was her father. She was small, dark-haired, and unlike every other child in the vehicle, she didn't smile. She didn't fidget or squeal or even look particularly present. She just sat there, still, pale and tired. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I'd seen plenty of grumpy kids, Maybe she was just hot or tired or had missed breakfast. Kids have bad days too. I dismissed it, letting the magic of the park sweep me back into a daze of colours, laughter and Disney songs. But I kept seeing her. Everywhere we went in Animal Kingdom, it was like they were always just a few steps ahead or behind us. We'd be at a ride and there she was. We'd grab a bite at a cafe and there she'd be, sitting with the same man. It could have been a coincidence, after all, we were all on the same general tourist trail. But what began to stand out wasn't just the frequency of the sightings, it was the pattern. She never smiled, never looked around, never asked for anything. Just followed. And then I started noticing his hand. At first it looked like a protective grip, a father holding his daughter's hand as they moved through crowds. But it wasn't gentle. It was firm. Too firm. I caught glimpses of her tugging lightly, as if testing for slack. Each time his grip would tighten and her shoulders would droop. No words, no scolding, just pressure and silence. We were in line for a snack when I turned to my dad and said something about it. He looked where I pointed, squinting for a moment, his smile faltering slightly. I thought he might scold me for staring again, but he didn't. His eyes tracked the pair for a while, and I could see his brow furrow slightly. Minutes later we were walking down a path shaded by fake jungle trees when it happened. The girl started to cry. Not a tantrum, not the wailing dramatics of a child denied a toy or snack. This was different. Softer at first, a rising panic. Her voice trembled through the crowd, saying, "I want my mummy! I want my mummy!" over and over. The man holding her didn't bend down to soothe her. He didn't whisper reassuringly. He just gripped tighter and muttered something too low to hear. Then, without warning, she blurted out something that changed everything. "I want Daddy. Where's my Daddy?" The effect on the people around them was instantaneous. Conversations faltered. Smiles fell. Parents exchanged glances. Someone, a man with a ball cap and sunglasses, stepped closer and said, "Hey buddy, is everything all right?" The man's reaction was calm. Too calm. "Yeah," he said, "she's just throwing a tantrum. Long day, you know." Another voice joined in. "You heard Dad?" "Yes," the man replied without hesitation. But the girl was still sobbing, and then, clear as day, she screamed, "He's not my daddy! He took me! He took me!" That was the moment the air shifted, like the weather before a storm, still heavy and charged. My mother pulled me and my sister to the side, shielding us. She whispered something to my father, and I remember his jaw tightening as he took a step forward, standing near the crowd that had begun to encircle the man and the girl. Everyone was speaking at once. Some demanded to know what was going on. Others urged caution. What if it was a misunderstanding? The man tried to leave, tried to tug the girl away, but a woman blocked his path, her arms spread wide, and shouted, "No! Not until someone checks." That was when the girl screamed again, and this time the man's hand snapped up and covered her mouth. Not gently, it sounded like a slap. The crowd gasped. Another man stepped forward, pulling out his phone to call for help. Disney security arrived faster than I thought possible, 2 officers in uniform pushing through the crowd as the man was restrained by several angry dads. They separated him from the child, who was quickly scooped into the arms of a park staffer, her face red, streaked with tears, her breath shuddering. What happened next was mostly a blur. I didn't see the man get led away. I didn't know what his explanation was or whether he offered one at all. All I know is that he didn't scream. He didn't plead, he just glared, his face twisted with something vile and bitter. Not fear, not remorse, just rage, pure boiling rage. That night, back at the hotel, no one spoke of it. Not during dinner, not before bed. It hung in the air like smoke from a fire we couldn't unsee. I remember lying awake, staring at the ceiling fan, thinking of that little girl, of how close she'd come to vanishing, of how easily it could have gone unnoticed. It wasn't until years later, when I was older, that my parents finally talked to me about what had happened. My dad had spoken with one of the security guards afterward, and they confirmed that the man had no relation to the child. He had followed her and her family earlier that day and waited for the moment when she wandered out of sight, just for a few seconds. It was enough. He convinced her that he'd been sent by her parents, promised her a solo tour of the park, promised her fun, promised her magic. She had believed him. If she hadn't screamed, if she hadn't said the words she did in front of so many people, she might have disappeared. Just another tragic headline, another poster stapled to a telephone pole, another face on the news, fading after the week's outrage had passed. I try not to dwell on that thought, but it returns to me often. I still see that girl in my mind sometimes, still hear her voice, shaky and small, repeating, "He's not my daddy." And I wonder how many others haven't had the chance to speak those words in time. How many smiles in places like Disney mask a darker intention? How many children are led away by people who know how to blend in, who know exactly when to strike? What haunts me most is not the fear I felt that day, but the possibility that no one would have acted, that we might have dismissed it, that the man could have walked away, melting into the crowd with a child who didn't know any better. But we did act. People stood up, someone said something, and because of that, a little girl went home that night. I don't know her name, I probably never will, but I think about her sometimes. I wonder if she remembers that day the way I do, if her dreams still echo with the terror she felt, or if time has managed to soften the edges. I hope it has, but for me, there's no forgetting, not when I think of the happiest place on earth. Not when I see a child looking lost in a crowd. Not when I hear a small voice asking for their parent. Because now I know the truth. Even in a world built on fantasy and magic, there are monsters. Story 4, The Skyway and the Fall of Ray. Some jobs you take because they pay the bills, others because they put food on the table or because you don't have a better option. But every so often there are jobs people take out of love. Not necessarily because of the salary or the hours, but because being there means something. For many of us working at Disney World back in the late 1990s, it was exactly that, a labour of joy. We weren't just cleaning floors or greeting tourists. We were part of a fantasy that millions of people came to believe in, if only for a little while. And among us all, there was no one who believed in that dream more than Ray. Ray wasn't your typical cast member. He was older than most of us, well into his 60s, but his energy could put a teenager to shame. Always whistling, always smiling, and always helping out, even if something wasn't in his job description. He had this calming presence, a kind of quiet warmth that made you feel like everything was under control. It didn't matter if the line at Space Mountain was backed up, or if a kid had just dropped their ice cream for the 3rd time. Ray could step in, make a joke, and turn everything around. He worked as a custodian in the Magic Kingdom, which sounds like a fancy word for janitor. And it kind of was, but in truth it meant so much more. We weren't just sweeping up popcorn or scrubbing sticky handrails. We gave directions, answered questions, guided lost guests, and sometimes even played therapist when people were overwhelmed. It was like being the invisible glue that held the fantasy together. You didn't go to Disney to meet the janitor, but if something went wrong, you'd be glad we were there. I remember the morning like it was carved into my memory. It was February 1999, a cool but sunny morning in Orlando. The park hadn't opened yet, which meant it was that sweet window of time where we could walk around in peace, check for safety hazards, and do our usual morning cleaning routines. I'd been assigned to help tidy up Fantasyland and Tomorrowland, which were some of my favourite areas. The music was whimsical and everything just looked magical in the soft light before the crowds rolled in. I was walking past Cinderella's carousel when I saw Ray up ahead, standing on the Skyway platform. He was sweeping, just like always, humming something upbeat, a little tune you couldn't quite recognise but somehow lifted your spirits anyway. I called out to him, "Morning, Ray Ray." He looked down, grinned, and waved his broom like it was a magic wand. "Back at it again," he shouted. I remember smiling to myself. Just another morning in the most magical place on earth. But Just a few minutes later, that magic would shatter. As I walked toward Tomorrowland, I heard the whirring hum of machinery starting up. It was the Skyway. The ride wasn't open yet, but we often ran early test loops to check for any mechanical issues. Gondolas would slowly move across the wire lines, gliding from Fantasyland to Tomorrowland and back again. But something about that sound made me stop. My heart didn't know why, but it beat harder. My brain caught up just a second later, and then everything clicked. Ray, he was still on the platform. He didn't know. Panic lit my veins like fire. I turned around and broke into a run, cutting across the empty space between us. I could see the gondolas moving faster than they should have been. Maybe someone had flipped the switch a few minutes too early. Maybe it was just a scheduling miscommunication. But there Ray was, back still turned, still sweeping, still humming. I shouted his name, loud, desperate. He turned, confused, and when he looked up and saw the gondolas barreling toward him, I saw his expression shift from confusion to fear. Not panic, just a sharp, cutting realization. He turned back to the platform, trying to move fast, but he wasn't as quick as he used to be. His legs were stiff, his balance just a little off. He tried to get clear, he really did. But he didn't make it. The first gondola clipped him hard in the shoulder, spinning him sideways. He reached out, grabbed the side rail, and for a second I thought he had it. I thought he was going to be okay, but then the weight shifted and he was dangling 60 feet above the ground, holding on with both hands, legs swinging beneath him. I was below, helpless, shouting, begging him to hang on. Just stay there, Ray, we're getting help. But there was no help yet. No one else had seen, no emergency crew nearby, just me shouting into the wind while Ray clung to the edge of the gondola like a man hanging from the sky. He looked down, then up at me. His eyes were wide with pain and panic, but he didn't scream. He didn't cry. He just stared. And that image, it's what I still see at night when I can't sleep. His face, his hands turning white around the knuckles. And then his grip slipped. I watched him fall, all 60 feet. It wasn't fast the way you'd think. It felt slow, like time warped itself, stretching the moment so it would never end. He hit a flower bed near the edge of the pathway, a burst of soil like an explosion of color and pain. His body crumpled on impact. And then silence. I ran. I dropped everything and sprinted. When I got to him, he was still alive, but barely. His eyes were open, glassy. Blood bubbled at the corner of his mouth. His ribs were shattered, one leg bent at a sickening angle. I knelt beside him and whispered that help was coming, that it was going to be okay. He tried to nod. The ambulance arrived maybe 15 minutes later, but every second felt like an hour. I held his hand as they loaded him onto the stretcher. I didn't cry then. I didn't even blink. I just watched as they drove away, lights flashing, and prayed he'd survive. But he didn't. Ray died in the hospital a few hours later. Too many injuries, too much internal bleeding. The flower bed had softened the blow, but not enough. We were told he'd held on longer than most would have, that he was strong, but it didn't matter. He was gone. The aftermath was hard. Disney tried to handle it with grace. They set up counseling sessions, held a private ceremony for cast members, and even placed a small memorial plaque backstage. But for those of us who had worked beside Ray every day, it wasn't enough. Not really. The park kept spinning, the rides kept running, but something had broken that day. A spell had lifted. The person who turned on the Skyway never forgave themselves. I won't name them. They weren't malicious, it was just a mistake. A checklist not double-checked. A button pressed too soon. But they quit the job soon after. Couldn't walk past the platform. Couldn't face the sound of the gondola cables anymore. And me? I stayed. For a while. But every morning felt different after that. The sparkle was dimmed. The joy a little more forced. I found myself checking corners, testing ride locks, hovering a little longer over routine tasks. The magic hadn't vanished, but the illusion of perfection had. Ray had always told us that the park wasn't perfect. It was the people who made it feel that way. The little acts of kindness, the quiet patience, the smiles that came from the heart. And he was right. But when he left, we all felt that gap in the foundation. Like one brick had been removed and the whole wall shifted just slightly. I still think of him when I hear certain songs, still see him in the curve of a broom or the soft flicker of morning light on a shiny park bench. I've moved on, career-wise. I don't work in parks anymore, but sometimes I visit, not for the rides or the shows, but to walk, to breathe, to feel the quiet spaces in between the noise. And every time I pass the spot where Ray fell, I stop, not to mourn, but to remember, because even in a world built on joy, built to shield you from the real and the painful, there are moments that remind you how fragile it all is, how 1 second can change everything, and how the ones who keep the dream alive are often the ones you never see. Rest easy, Ray. You were the heart of the Magic Kingdom, and in my memory, you always will be. Story 5. The Backpack in the Woods. There's something deeply humbling about moving to a new place, especially when that place is unlike anything you've ever known. That's how I felt 2 years ago, when I left behind the familiar rhythm of Idaho and drove north through the sweeping highways of Canada into the vast and untamed frontier that is Alaska. I was searching for solitude, clarity, maybe even adventure. What I found was something else entirely. The house I was renting sat on the edge of a town so small it barely had a name. From the back porch, you could look out and see nothing but trees, acres and acres of forest that stretched as far as the eye could see. No traffic noise, no neighbors shouting, just the wind threading through pine needles, the occasional call of a bird, and the deep echoing silence that only wilderness can provide. For someone like me, who had always craved peace, it felt like paradise. But isolation has a funny way of revealing not just the world around you, but something deeper inside, something you might not be ready to see. I had only been there a week, just long enough to recover from the exhausting drive. I was still unpacking, still learning the quirks of the old place, when I decided it was time to explore. The weather was crisp, not too cold, and the forest was calling to me with a kind of quiet insistence. So I laced up my running shoes, grabbed my phone and slipped in my earbuds. Looking back, I can't believe how unprepared I was. No map, no compass, no water bottle, no emergency supplies, just a phone that didn't even get signal in the wilds of Alaska, and a playlist of shaky folk songs to keep me company. I set off on a narrow trail behind the house, weaving between towering trees and leaping over roots like I was in some kind of adventure movie. For a while it was exhilarating. The air was sharp in my lungs, the ground soft beneath my feet. I ran, not with urgency, but with joy. I lost track of time, of distance, of direction. The turning point came when my foot snagged on a hidden root, and I went flying forward, landing hard against a patch of damp earth. The fall knocked the wind out of me, and by the time I sat up, brushing pine needles from my clothes, I realized I had no idea where I was. The trail behind me had vanished, swallowed up by the trees. I looked around, heart pounding, trying to retrace my steps, but every direction looked the same. Trees, bushes, more trees. It was as if the forest had closed in behind me, hiding the way home. Still, I didn't panic. At first, I chose a direction and started walking. My gut told me it was the right way. I figured if I kept moving, I'd see a fence line, a clearing, something to guide me back. But as the minutes stretched into half an hour, then longer, that confidence began to fray. That's when I saw it. A backpack, sitting at the bottom of a small slope, half covered by fallen leaves and damp from the morning rain. It looked like it had been there for a few days, maybe more. Something about it didn't sit right with me. It wasn't just the suddenness of it, the way it had been tucked out of sight. It was the way it seemed to be waiting. Curiosity got the better of me. I slid down the hill and crouched beside the pack, brushing off the leaves. It was heavier than I expected. I unzipped the main compartment, half expecting to find a jacket, maybe a book. But what I saw made the world shift sideways. Inside were plastic bags, each one sealed, each one filled with white or crystalline powder. Alongside them were syringes, scorched spoons, and rubber tubing. Drugs, hard drugs, a lot of them. I froze. My heart began to thud in my ears. I looked around, half expecting someone to step out from behind a tree, demanding to know what I was doing. But the woods remained still. I stood up, my breath shallow, and backed away from the bag like it might explode. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I didn't know which way to go. Then I saw it. A house, or at least what looked like one, half buried in the trees at the edge of a clearing maybe 100 yards from where I'd found the backpack. A wooden cabin, weathered and quiet. Smoke didn't rise from the chimney, no car was parked out front, no light glowed behind the windows, and yet something about it felt aware, like it was watching me. I stood frozen at the top of the hill, eyes fixed on the house. My first instinct was to approach, to knock on the door and ask for help, but something in me, something primal, told me not to. Not just caution, but dread. Like walking toward that house would be stepping into a trap. My eyes darted between the house and the backpack, trying to connect the dots, the drugs, the isolated location, the eerie stillness. I couldn't be sure, but I had the overwhelming sense that someone lived there, someone who didn't want visitors, someone who might be very, very dangerous. And I had just stumbled across something I wasn't supposed to see. I turned and ran. I didn't care which direction, I just needed to get away from that place. Branches slapped against my face, thorns tore at my legs. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, collapsing behind a thicket. I stayed low, barely daring to breathe. After several long minutes I gathered myself and moved again, this time slower, more cautiously, sticking close to the tree line. Eventually, mercifully, I saw something familiar. A fence, a road, and then a man working in his yard. I must have looked like a ghost, mud-streaked, panting, wild-eyed, because he dropped his rake the moment he saw me. I told him I was lost, and he offered to drive me home. I didn't tell him about the backpack, not at first, but as we drove I couldn't shake the thought of that house, that presence. So once I got home, I called the police. I explained everything I'd seen, the drugs, the house, the backpack. But when they asked for the location, I realized I had no idea how to guide them there. I hadn't dropped a pin, hadn't taken a photo. The forest had disoriented me completely. All I had was a memory, and even that felt slippery, uncertain. The officer on the line was polite, but I could tell I was wasting his time. Without coordinates or an address, there wasn't much they could do. Alaska was huge, and the woods even more so. But I had to say something. I had to try, because what if that place wasn't just a hideout? What if it was something worse? A trap, a den, a tomb. For weeks after, I kept trying to find it again. I drove down every road branching off the highway, scoured maps, retraced steps, but the woods refused to give it back. The trail was gone. The trees had shifted, or maybe I just wasn't meant to find it twice. In the end, I let it go. Sort of. I started locking my doors at night, stopped going for runs alone. I bought a satellite GPS and kept it charged, because as beautiful as the wilderness is, I now know what can hide within it. Not bears, not wolves, something worse. People. People who build quiet cabins in the middle of nowhere. People who leave their secrets in the dirt, waiting for someone curious enough to lift the lid. Sometimes, late at night, I imagine what might have happened if I'd approached that house, knocked on the door, asked for help. Would I have been welcomed in? Or would I have vanished? Just another name on a missing persons list, my final moments lost among the pines. I'll never know. Maybe that's the point. Some places aren't meant to be found. Some trails are best left untraveled, and some backpacks are better left unopened. Story 6. The Girl in the Front Room. When you're young and finally living alone for the first time, there's a kind of quiet pride that settles into your life. It's not about money or status or even freedom. It's about privacy, about carving out a small piece of the world that belongs only to you. That's how I felt during my second year of university when I rented a small downstairs flat near the heart of the city. It wasn't fancy and it wasn't particularly spacious, but it was mine. The walls were thin, sure, and the kitchen rattled whenever someone in the unit above me dropped a spoon, but I didn't care. For the first time, I had my own bedroom, my own space to study, unwind, and sleep in peace. The only real downside was that my room faced the street. It wasn't a main road or anything, more of a residential lane with modest foot traffic, but it meant that my large window gave anyone walking by a full view into my room. I was aware of this, of course, and took precautions. I hung thick forest green curtains that pulled slightly at the floor. At night I kept them drawn tightly shut. It wasn't paranoia, it was habit, caution. A sort of quiet understanding with the outside world. You stay out there, I'll stay in here. Still, sometimes that barrier between outside and in feels thinner than it should. During the day, I'd usually be out with friends. Their flat was about 15 minutes away and I was over there most evenings, watching movies, drinking tea and talking late into the night about classes and crushes and everything in between. On weekends, I often crashed on their couch. Other nights, I'd return to my flat, the streets quiet, my breath visible in the cool air, the city reduced to a sleepy murmur. I never felt unsafe, not really, until the night everything changed. It was Halloween. My friends had gone to a party, but I wasn't in the mood. Instead, I decided to head home early and surprise my long-distance boyfriend with a late-night video call. We had a tradition of Skyping whenever we had the chance. Sometimes we talked for hours. Other times, well, let's just say that being apart didn't always mean being distant. That night, we slipped into one of those flirtatious, intimate calls. He teased me. I teased back. It was harmless fun, meant only for him. I had the lights off, just the soft glow of the laptop screen lighting my room. My heavy curtains were shut. The door was locked. Everything felt private, safe. I was focused on the screen, my headphones in, half laughing, half whispering into the camera, when I saw something, a flicker, just in the corner of my eye. At first I thought it was a reflection, a trick of the light. Then it came again. A subtle, barely noticeable shimmer, near the top of the curtain where it didn't quite seal against the wall. A wisp of condensation, a rising thread of breath. My heart slowed. Then it began to pound. I froze, my fingers hovering above the keyboard. Slowly, quietly, I stood and stepped onto my mattress, balancing carefully as I reached up to peer through the gap. I didn't want to believe what I suspected, but the moment I looked out, every instinct in my body screamed. There was a man, standing just inches from my window. His face was pressed so close to the glass that his breath fogged the pain in rhythmic bursts. I could see the silhouette of his chest, bare and pale, glistening faintly with sweat. He was panting, watching, and then, dear God, he was touching himself. He had found the smallest gap in my curtains, barely 2 inches wide, and had angled himself just enough to get a view of me, of what I thought had been a private moment. He was watching, hunched forward, completely silent, not moving, not hiding, just staring. I scrambled back, falling awkwardly off the bed. I wrapped myself in a blanket and rushed into the living room, my hands shaking so hard I could barely type out a message to my boyfriend. I ended the call without explanation and locked every door and window I could. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed on the couch, fully dressed, phone in hand, heart hammering in my chest. I told myself it had to be a fluke, a one-time encounter with a random pervert. I didn't know his face. I didn't even know if he'd seen me. Maybe he was just passing by and got curious. But then came the envelope. It was 3 days later. I came home from class, my backpack heavy with books, my mind still on a lecture about cognitive psychology, when I saw it on the floor just inside the door. A small pink envelope, sealed. As I picked it up, coins fell out, pennies and pounds, enough to make a faint clink as they scattered across the floor. On the flap of the envelope, in jagged all-capital letters, were the words, "I mean you no harm." 31 cards. I mean you no harm. 31 cards. I mean you no harm. 31 cards. I stared at it for a long time before I opened it. I knew I shouldn't, but I did. Inside was a greeting card. A soft watercolor bouquet on the front. "Thinking of you," it read in delicate cursive. Inside the message had been replaced with blocky, uneven handwriting, every inch of space filled with writing. Some words were misspelled, some letters reversed. I don't have the card anymore, I gave it to the police, but the message burned itself into my memory. He told me that he had been living on the street, possibly on my street, or maybe he meant homeless. That on Halloween night, I had made him the happiest he had ever been. That I was beautiful, that he loved to watch me working, laughing, touching myself. That he didn't mean to frighten me but hoped I'd leave the curtains open again. Just a little, just enough. And in return, every time I did, he promised to leave money through the door. "For you," he wrote. "Only for you." He signed it Ken. 5 X's, my kisses. I called my friends first, then the police. 2 officers came to the flat that evening. They were sympathetic, professional. They took the card as evidence and gave me a case number. They promised to drive past the building more often for the next few weeks, but that was all they could do. There had been no crime, they said, no clear threat, just a disturbing incident. I didn't sleep alone for the next week. Friends stayed over, sleeping in shifts, keeping watch. I kept the curtains clamped shut with binder clips, but Ken Gettler didn't stop. There were knocks on the window, late at night. Light at first, then louder. A slow, steady tapping that I couldn't unhear, even when I moved to the far end of the flat. Sometimes I thought I saw shadows through the curtains, but I never looked. I never opened them again. I didn't want to know. And then winter came. One morning, after the first snowfall of the season, I opened the front door to leave for class, and I stopped. There, in the thin layer of snow outside my window, were footprints, dozens of them, pacing back and forth, right in front of the glass. A restless loop, as if someone had been walking for hours, searching for an angle. A crack, a sliver of light. That was the moment I decided to move. I found a new place a few months later, farther from campus but safer. No windows facing the street, thicker locks, a second-floor unit. I told myself it was over, that Ken had been left behind, just a strange chapter in the story of my student years. But that wasn't quite true. A few years after I moved, I was walking through my old neighborhood. I had stayed friends with a girl who still lived in the area, and we decided to meet for lunch. As I passed my old flat, something caught my eye. The window, my window. It was covered in newspaper, taped from the inside, layer after layer, sealed tight. Someone new had moved in, and they were having the same problem. Ken hadn't gone away. He was still out there, still watching, still waiting. And as I stood there, heart pounding, I realized something I had always suspected but never admitted aloud. He had never been watching, just once. He had been watching for a long, long time. Story 7, The Man in the Stall. It was the summer of 2016. I was 14 years old, caught somewhere between childhood and adolescence, still wide-eyed enough to believe in the goodness of the world, but old enough to sense when something wasn't quite right. That summer, my grandmother had decided to take my 2 younger sisters and me on a road trip to Texas. It wasn't just a vacation, it was a family pilgrimage. Her brother, my great-uncle, lived in San Antonio, along with his wife. My grandmother hadn't seen him in years, and now that my great-uncle's health was failing, she wanted to reconnect while there was still time. We packed up our bags, loaded the car, and drove nearly 20 hours across state lines. The drive was long, and by the end we were sticky with sweat, tired of gas station snacks and deeply grateful to stretch our legs. But despite the exhaustion, I was excited. There was something about being on the road with family that made everything feel like an adventure. My great-uncle lived in a military retirement home, and though it wasn't a place designed to entertain teenagers, it fascinated me. The walls were covered with old photos, medals, and stories you could almost feel pressing out from the past. He was frail, soft-spoken, and slow to move, but he lit up when my grandmother walked in. They laughed and talked about their childhood, and we sat nearby, listening to their memories unravel, like threads from a tapestry none of us knew we were part of. The trip passed quickly. We explored local diners and antique shops. We bought little trinkets, wandered through humid gardens, and tried to ignore the thick heat that clung to our skin like glue. One morning, we went to a small community thrift shop where I found an old, heavy letter opener shaped like a dagger. I thought it was the coolest thing ever. I tucked it into my bag, planning to joke with my friends back home about my ancient weapon. In many ways, it was a typical family trip. Quiet, easy, full of gentle conversations and tired evenings. But our final day in Texas brought a turn I never could have seen coming. My grandmother had one last stop she insisted we make before we left, the Holocaust Museum in San Antonio. It wasn't a tourist attraction for her, it was personal. Her father, my great-grandfather, had been one of the first American doctors to arrive at Dachau, a Nazi concentration camp during the liberation. There was a photograph of him inside the museum, standing behind a pile of bodies looking weary and hollow. It wasn't just history, it was family. She wanted us to see it, to understand it, to remember. We agreed, of course. Even my little sisters, who were too young to truly grasp the weight of the history, understood that this meant something to her. The museum itself was smaller than I expected, but hauntingly intimate. The lights were dimmed, the walls lined with photographs that painted a quiet horror, black and white images of skeletal figures in striped uniforms, eyeglasses piled like debris, barbed wire, signs with numbers, shoes, dirt-smudged and small. The silence inside was palpable, the kind of silence that seems to absorb sound. Every footstep felt too loud, every whisper seemed to echo. As we walked through the exhibits, I felt an urgent need creeping up inside me, not fear, but a biological call. I needed to use the restroom. I tried to hold it, not wanting to break the somber rhythm of the visit. But the urge only grew stronger, and by the time my grandmother found the photograph of her father, I could barely think about anything else. She stood there, pointing at the image, telling one of the museum staff about how he'd come home changed, how he never spoke of it except to say, it smelled like death. I wanted to stay. I wanted to listen, but I couldn't. My sister, whom I would call Jay, noticed me squirming and pointed toward a sign just around the corner. "Restrooms that way," she whispered. I thanked her and made my way there quickly. The hallway was narrow, lined with plaques. I barely glanced at them. The women's restroom was quiet, and for a moment I thought I'd have it to myself. But as I pushed the door open, I was met with the echo of soft chatter. 2 or 3 women were inside, some fixing their hair, others washing their hands. I froze slightly. See, I've always had trouble using public restrooms when others are present. I don't know why. Something about the closeness, the vulnerability, the echoes of everything, it just shuts my body down. So I waited. I leaned against the sink, pretending to check my phone, hoping they'd leave soon. And thankfully, they did. Within a few minutes, I was alone. The room was silent again, and I finally relaxed. I picked the stall second from the left, right next to the handicap one, and stepped inside. But the moment I sat down, that relaxed feeling vanished. A chill prickled across my neck. A whisper of dread settled on my shoulders like a heavy coat. I held my breath, listening. There was nothing. No voices, no footsteps, just the faint hum of the air vent. But I felt it. Something was wrong. I opened the stall door slowly and stepped out. At first glance, the restroom looked perfectly normal. All 6 stalls were closed, the mirrors clean, the sink still wet from previous use. But I couldn't shake the feeling. Something told me to look. Not just glance, but really look. So I turned, facing the handicap stall. The door was shut, but beneath it, barely visible, was a small shoe. A child's shoe, pale blue, scuffed. My breath hitched. No sound came from within, no rustling, no movement, just that shoe. I leaned back slightly, trying to get a better view without making noise, and then I saw it. Hair. Long, dark hair brushing the tile floor, just inches from the shoe. Whoever was inside was crouching low, unnaturally low, and completely still. I ran. I burst from the bathroom, heart racing, adrenaline flooding my chest. My sisters were waiting nearby, chatting by a display. I grabbed them both by the arms, pulling them toward me with wide eyes. "Is there someone in the stall?" I whispered, breathless. "A kid, hiding, and hair. I don't know what's going on, but something's not right." They stared at me, confused and slightly amused, but the urgency in my voice must have reached them, because Jay nodded. "Show us." I led them back, slowly this time, quietly. We crept into the restroom, tiptoeing like we were entering a sacred space. My younger sister peered beneath the handicap stall, then gasped. The shoe was still there, and now we could both see it. The hair spilling over the tile, unmoving. It was like time had frozen. Jay looked at me, then at the door, then back to me. "That's not right," she said softly. "That's not normal." Without a word, we turned and left again. We went straight to our grandmother. She was still standing by the photograph, her eyes misty, speaking to a museum employee. We interrupted, apologetically, breathlessly, and explained everything. The staff member listened carefully. Her expression changed as we spoke, shifting from polite interest to deep concern. When we mentioned the hair and the stillness and the child's shoe, she nodded and called over a security guard. He was large, broad-shouldered, and wore a stern face that softened slightly when he heard the word child. He told us to wait with our grandmother, then walked briskly toward the restroom. Minutes passed. Then he returned. "There's a man in there," he said quietly, "on his phone, with a kid." The room seemed to tilt. My heart dropped. My stomach twisted. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I stood frozen. A man, in the women's restroom, in the handicap stall, with a child. The staff member whispered something to the guard, and he nodded. Then, without further explanation, he left again, this time with purpose in his stride. We didn't wait to see what happened next. My grandmother took one look at our faces, grabbed her purse, and ushered us out of the museum. We climbed into the car in silence. No one spoke, not until we were halfway down the freeway, and even then, we didn't say much. I never learned what became of that man, whether he was arrested, whether the child was safe, whether he even noticed us at all. But the image of that shoe haunts me. The hair, the stillness, the sense that we had arrived at a moment that wasn't meant to be seen and might not have been seen by anyone else. Had I not needed to pee? I still think about it, about what might have happened if I hadn't looked, if I hadn't run to my sisters, if the staff hadn't believed us. There are moments in life when the veil lifts just slightly and you see the darkness hiding in the corners, the kind of darkness that wears the shape of ordinary people, the kind that slips into museums, waiting. And the worst part? It didn't make a sound. Story 8. The reflection in the cabin window. Some places are beautiful enough to make you forget the rest of the world exists. Our family cabin in northern Michigan was like that. Nestled deep in the woods, far from the nearest gas station or grocery store, it was surrounded by thick pine trees and the soft lapping sounds of a nearby lake. My grandfather had built it in the late 70s, a sturdy structure of cedar and stone, one bedroom downstairs, a loft above, and a porch that wrapped halfway around the cabin like a lazy arm. Growing up, it was where we escaped from the noise. No Wi-Fi, no cable, and barely a phone signal. Just card games, firewood, old books, and mosquito spray. The kind of place where you could fall asleep to the chirping of crickets and wake up to morning mist rolling off the lake. By the time I was 17, I'd grown used to spending long weekends there. Sometimes it was a full family trip, parents, cousins, uncles, aunts, the whole chaotic crew. Other times it was just me and my older brother, Grant. We'd fish off the dock, grill burgers and talk about college or girls or the weird dreams we'd been having. Grant was 2 years older, calmer, more grounded. I looked up to him in a quiet way, and he had a way of making you feel like everything was under control, no matter what. The last time we stayed at the cabin together, it was late October. The leaves had already turned and the temperature dipped enough to warrant extra blankets and flannel shirts. We had come up for one final weekend before winter sealed the place off. Snow in Michigan could be relentless, and the cabin's pipes weren't built for deep freeze. So this was our goodbye for now trip. Just the two of us, no distractions. The first day was perfect. Crisp air, the smell of pine and wood smoke, and enough silence to make you forget what city noise even sounded like. We spent the day chopping wood, stacking it in a neat pile near the porch. That night we made chili, played poker, and listened to old music from my dad's cassette collection. Around midnight, we turned in. I took the loft, Grant the couch below. I remember lying on the mattress beneath the sloped ceiling, watching the shadows dance on the wooden beams as the firelight flickered through the grate. Everything felt peaceful, until I heard it. A knock, not loud, just a soft, deliberate tap, tap, tap on the window. I froze. My first thought was a branch, the wind, but the air had been still all night. Another knock came, then silence. I pulled back the blanket and crept to the edge of the loft, peering down at Grant. He was still asleep, one arm dangling off the couch. The fire was low, casting long shadows across the floor. I waited, listened. Nothing. Eventually I told myself I had imagined it. Lay back down, closed my eyes. But I didn't sleep well. The next morning I mentioned it to Grant. He shrugged, half smiling. Probably just a raccoon, or a bird smacking the glass. Don't overthink it. I nodded, but the unease lingered. That afternoon, we took the rowboat out onto the lake. The sky was overcast, a gentle grey blanket stretched above the water. We didn't talk much, just floated and let the silence settle between us. Something about that day felt heavier than usual, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Back at the cabin, Grant chopped more wood while I wandered the edge of the tree line looking for kindling. That's when I saw it, half buried near a tree stump, a set of footprints. At first I thought they were ours, but they were too small, narrow, light, like someone barefoot had walked through the woods. The weird part was the direction. The prints didn't lead to the cabin, they led away from it. I called Grant over. He studied the tracks, brow furrowing. Could be old, he said. Maybe someone camping nearby passed through. But I didn't believe that. The prints were too clear, too fresh. The soil was still damp and the edges hadn't even begun to fade. Whoever it was, they'd been there recently. That night we locked the cabin doors for the first time since arriving. As the fire died down and the cabin slipped into quiet, I stayed awake in the loft, staring out the window above the bed. It looked out toward the forest, and though the moonlight barely reached that far, I kept thinking about those footprints. Who left them? Why were they barefoot? Why so close to our cabin? Around 2 a.m. I heard the knocking again. This time, it was louder. 3 knocks. A pause. Then another. Knock, knock, knock. I sat up in bed, my chest tight. The sound wasn't coming from the loft window. It was downstairs, the front window, near where Grant slept. I crept down the ladder, careful not to make a sound. The room was dim, the fire just embers now. Grant was still on the couch, but he was awake, his eyes open and staring at the window. He didn't say anything. I moved beside him, whispering, Did you hear it? He nodded once, slowly. Yeah. We waited. Silence. Then, from behind us, the knock came again. Not from the front window, from the kitchen window. We turned as one, slowly, and there, in the faint glow of the dying fire, we saw a silhouette, a face, pressed against the glass, just barely visible, like a smudge on the night. I stumbled backward. Grant stood up, grabbed the fireplace poker. He stepped forward, heart pounding, but when he flung open the back door, nothing. No one. Just cold air and shadows. We didn't sleep that night. The next morning, we checked the windows. No prints, no smudges, no sign that anyone had been there. We searched the woods, circled the property, even yelled out to see if anyone responded. But the forest gave us nothing. We decided to leave a day early. As we packed up, I climbed the loft one last time to grab my phone charger, and as I turned to go, I glanced at the window above the bed. There was a handprint, faint, small, like a child's, pressed into the glass from inside.